Well, welcome back from the break. Let's take a look at the two concept check questions, and then we'll start talking about hominins or human-like animals, which of course includes ourselves. So compare how monotremes, marsupials, and eutherians bear their young. So what we're looking at here are the basic methodologies by which these three groups of mammals give birth. So monotremes, remember, lay eggs that are very reminiscent of reptile eggs. They have the soft, leathery covering. When the young hatch from these eggs, however, they're very, very poorly developed. And they basically crawl to the mother's belly and start lapping milk from the mammary glands that exit directly on the surface of the skin. So there's no nipples or anything like that. The young simply lap the milk off the surface of the mother's skin. And they complete their development outside of an egg and basically in the open within the burrow that the animals have created as their habitat. For marsupials, they dispense with the shelled egg and retain the egg within the body of the mother. The early embryological development occurs internally, and then the young are born in a very poorly developed state, reminiscent of the state of the young of the monotremes when they initially hatch from the egg. Only this time, they make their way to the pouch, the marsupium, from which the marsupial name is derived, and crawl in there where they find the mammary glands in the form of nipples that they attach to, and they suckle on the mother's milk inside the marsupium and develop to the point where they begin to become capable of independent existence, which may take a little bit of time. And I talked a little bit about that earlier in the presentation. Then for eutherians, again, embryo develops internally within the mother, supported within the uterus via the placenta that provides nutrients and waste removal and gas exchange. And the early embryological development takes place inside the uterus, and the young is born essentially capable of semi-independent existence, in that it is capable of surviving without support from the mother other than in terms of feeding. Now that is variable depending on which of the eutherian mammals we're talking about. Some young mammals, like horses and so forth, their young are very, very independent in that within hours they can stand on their own legs and they can follow their mothers as they migrate around the grasslands. They still obviously feed from the mother via the mammary glands, but they are capable of some independent existence. But that's necessary because of the lifestyle of the animals. Others are still rather dependent on their mothers, and we could look there to primates, where the young spend a significant amount of time with the parents. And obviously, when we think in terms of humans, the amount of time that a human juvenile spends with its parents is quite long, comparatively speaking, to the percentage of the total lifetime. So it varies from amongst the eutherians as to how much dependence the juvenile has on its mother, but there is a level of dependence in terms of the necessity to feed from the mammary glands because the milk provides the initial nutrition. Describe at least 5 derived traits of primates. So we could include there a large brain relative to body size. We could include nails instead of claws. We could include an opposable thumb. We could include the ridges on the digits and the palms of the appendages for gripping. We could talk in terms of stereoscopic vision because the eyes are placed on the front of the face and look forwards. There's any number of traits that you could include here. We talked about a significant number of them when I introduced the idea of primates. And so you could go back and take a look at that slide any combination of 5 would work as an answer to a question like this. So let's now start the last section of the presentation, where we focus on a group of organisms that have now been labeled as hominins. We used to use a number of different terms. Hominoid did refer to humans at one point, or to human-like organisms, and hominin, rather surprisingly, was used to reference ape-like creatures. And then we had the term hominid, which has fallen out of favor completely, other than to be a root for the Latin term for the larger clade that apes and humans belong to, hominidae. But we don't use the term hominid anymore with reference to humans. We prefer, or human-like creatures. We prefer the term hominin. So we have to remember what each of these terms reference. So hominoid are ape-like creatures, which includes ourselves and includes all hominins, but the term hominin refers specifically to those creatures that are more human-like than ape-like, and therefore are given a binomial name that includes the genus Homo, and so they are members of genus Homo. Homo sapiens, of course, is the only species amongst genus Homo that is extant today, and you may recall from the taxonomy lab that we actually refer to ourselves as Homo sapiens sapiens, or subspecies sapiens, because we draw a distinction between early humans and modern humans, or early Homo sapiens and modern Homo sapiens, because there is a suggestion that early Homo sapiens, as they evolved in Africa, are different from modern Homo sapiens as we recognize them today. And part of that is simply because of the obvious interbreeding between Homo sapiens and other members of genus Homo that they encountered as they migrated out of Africa to reach all the 4 corners of the earth as they migrated out. They did encounter other members of genus Homo, and they were similar enough that they could interbreed. And the evidence for that is the presence of genes within the genome of modern Homo sapiens that are clearly derived from the genomes of these other members of the genus Homo that they encountered. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we progress through this section. So in terms of our own origin as a distinctly separate species, we see the first evidence of Homo sapiens about 200,000 years ago in what is known as the Rift Valley region of East Africa, which includes Tanganyika, Kenya, Uganda. The Rift Valley extends as a fracture in the Earth's crust northwards from Tanganyika all the way through to the Red Sea. And in fact, this is a region of active volcanism and geological activity. It represents a zone of spreading. And eventually, at some point in the not too distant future, geologically at least, the northern end in the area of Eritrea and Ethiopia is going to open up sufficiently that the sea will rush in and will flood down all the way down through the Rift Valley and start isolating the eastern region of Africa from the rest of the African continent. And at some point in the future, it will actually break free. And we think it's this geological activity that has given rise to the large number of members of genus Homo, and also the large number of hominins and related species that have been discovered in Africa, particularly in this region. The fact that this is a very, very active geological zone with lots of changes occurring would be clearly a source of pressure to increase the rate of evolution and provide opportunities for adaptation amongst the organisms that occupied this region. And this has been true for members of the genus Homo as much as it is for any other type of organism that has occupied this region of Africa over geological time. And so this is possibly the best explanation as to why so many hominins evolved in a very, very short period of time, roughly around 6 to 6.5 million years. We can recognize about 20 distinct species, and we're actually finding a few more in recent years that have not been incorporated in great detail into the textbook just yet because they're such recent discoveries. But it is likely that there are other members of genus Homo and related species still to be discovered in Africa simply because of this geological pressure to promote adaptation and evolution because of the high rate of change due to this huge geological activity that we note there, which is ongoing. So this is probably the best explanation as to our origin, in fact. Why did our species originate? What we can't answer at the moment, or at least we don't have a really good answer, is why our species is the one that survived. Why didn't any of the other members of genus Homo, and particularly some of the species that have very similar features to our own, and perhaps even had levels of intelligence and culture that may have rivaled our own, why did they not succeed? Why did we succeed as a species? There is no really good answer to that right now, other than we know that Homo sapiens is the species that survived where others did not. So the derived characteristics of hominins you should be familiar with. The first one to appear in the fossil record is bipedalism, standing on hind legs. That occurred very, very shortly after the first species in the line that would eventually lead to all the hominins, including humans, diverged from the common ancestors that we share with chimpanzees and bonobos. Bipedalism occurred long before larger brains developed, long before all of those other features that we commonly associate with Homo sapiens and with members of genus Homo. Bipedalism was very much the first of the traits to appear. Brain volume starts to increase only more recently. So amongst all the Australopithecines, the brain volume remains rather small. It's only as we see some of the more recent members of genus Homo that we see an increase in the size of the brain. That probably corresponds with a couple of the other features that are here on the list. The manufacturing and use of complex tools, which makes food gathering a little easier. The mastery of fire so that you can cook your food, which means that you no longer need as complex a digestive tract because you're cooking your food. And there is also a switch with the use of tools, or a gradual switch from a diet based mainly on roots and berries, a more herbivore diet, to a more omnivore diet with the incorporation of meat, again, made possible but through the mastery of fire. That has also led to a change in the jaw. A large jaw with many teeth is obviously necessary for processing the tough material that plants produce and would have formed a large part of the diet. With the change in the diet, the necessity to have such a large jaw with many teeth to process the food is reduced. And so some of these things go hand in hand. With that larger brain, now comes the possibility for higher thought. And the one type of thought that we think is strictly associated with Homo sapiens, but perhaps may have been present in Neanderthals. We don't know about some of the other related species that lived at the same time, because we have very little fossil evidence for them. But certainly with Neanderthals, we have a substantial fossil record, comparatively speaking, and it is possible that Neanderthals could think symbolically in much the same way that we do, but that's open to question. Likewise, language. It is unclear as to whether Neanderthals had language capabilities that we associate with Homo sapiens. We do know that genetically, the genes that have been discovered to be associated with language in Homo sapiens are present in almost an identical form in Neanderthals. So at least genetically, the possibility of language in Neanderthals is there. But of course, we can't test that hypothesis because we don't have Neanderthals available to find out whether they could actually talk or not. But one of the things that we should not lose sight of is the fact that many of our related cousins within genus Homo probably shared many of these characteristics with ourselves, and this would create a clear line of distinction between hominins and the apes, but also with some of the more exclusive characteristics that we think are associated with strictly with Homo sapiens would differentiate Homo sapiens from other members of genus Homo. So when we start looking at the types of species that sit in the branch of hominins, we do recognize at least 20, and this is not inclusive because it leaves out some of the more recent discoveries, but it does show you a progressive development that we do recognize in the fossil record. Now, one of the things that you have to avoid in thinking about human evolution is that there is a linearity in that evolutionary progress. Because if you take a look at the time bars on this diagram, you see that many of the species overlap. There is not a linear progression from the bottom left-hand corner to the top right-hand corner. And you should never confuse a diagram like this as suggesting a linear progressive evolution. That is not the case, because when you look at the gray vertical bars, you immediately recognize that there is substantial overlap. But there are a number of species here that are of particular interest to us because they show us some of the development or some of the early development of some of the traits that we do associate with hominins. So the first one is Ardipithecus ramidus, otherwise known as Ardi. And Ardi was bipedal. But what makes Ardi really important is that she indicates that bipedalism occurred very, very early, because she has an ape-like foot. In other words, she has the opposable big toe, and means that her foot, because the skeleton is female, that's why I refer to her as female, she has the opposable big toe, which means that her foot could be used as a grasping foot. And that, when Ardi was discovered and the interpretation of the skeleton was published, really threw everyone for a loop, because the argument had always been that you could not be bipedal with an ape-like foot, because if you look at the way chimpanzees walk when they try to walk bipedally, they can do so for some period of time, but they can't do it on a permanent basis because their hip and upper leg structure is simply all wrong. It doesn't support bipedal locomotion for any length of time. But Ardi has a hip structure and an upper leg structure that is very human-like in that her hips reposition her legs and specifically her knees underneath her rather than pushing the legs out to the side laterally as the hip structure of chimpanzees does. So when a chimpanzee walks, its legs are not underneath it, but its legs are splayed out to the side. Artie's legs tuck in underneath, just as yours do, with her knees sitting underneath or following on in a vertical line from the head through the center of the pelvis and down to the ground. Her knees are tucked in underneath her body when she stands upright. And that was something that was thought to be near impossible. And so once Artie was fully interpreted and it was recognized that this was the situation, she changed our thinking about the origin of bipedalism. The next species of interest is Australopithecus afarensis, sometimes called Lucy. So named because the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds from the Beatles was a very popular song in the top 40 list at the time that Lucy was discovered. So her name is a product of that situation. And apparently they had Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds playing on the radio quite a bit in the dig site as they were examining the skeleton. So Lucy is important because she now shows many, many human skeletal characteristics. Whereas Artie was very much ape-like in characteristics, Lucy starts to move more in the direction of Homo sapiens, human-like characteristics. So she does have the big toe located adjacent to the other digits. It's no longer an opposable toe. So it's a foot more in keeping with our own. She is also bipedal, but she is not terribly tall. Neither is Ardipithecus. Neither of them are more than about 3 feet in height. And again, Lucy, the Lucy skeleton is a female. And she belongs to the species that we believe is the species that left behind the first set of footprints that are clearly of hominin origin. These are the very famous Laetoli footprints that I referenced a little bit later in the presentation. And there are 3 individuals that have been interpreted as a family group because there are 2 adults and a juvenile. And so people have suggested that this may be a family group, a male, a female, and a juvenile that left their tracks behind in a damp or wet volcanic ash bed that then got covered with more ash and turned to rock, preserving the footprints. So Lucy is important because this is the first clear evidence of bipedalism. And Lucy dates back around 3.5 million years ago. So at that point, we have clear evidence of bipedalism with a foot that is similar to our own. The next important individual in the timeline is Homo habilis. And that means handyman, because this is the first evidence of tools. Or at least that's how it's been interpreted. Now, there is evidence that some other species outside of genus Homo, so some of the Australopithecines, may have been tool users. But in terms of manufacturing tools as a deliberate process, the first evidence of that lies with Homo habilis. So this is why the term handyman was associated with this species. That's why we get that. The next species of interest is Homo erectus. This is the first species to migrate out of Africa. and as such is likely to be the direct ancestor not only of Homo sapiens, because that is what we believe, but also the direct ancestor to Homo neanderthalensis, possibly Homo florensis, which you may have heard of referred to as the Hobbit, a miniature species of humans that lived on an island in the Indonesian archipelago, and probably evolved as a dwarf species because that is one of the responses to being isolated on an island amongst a lot of animals. So it's possible that Homo erectus was the direct ancestor, or it may very well be that Homo sapiens itself, very early Homo sapiens itself, may have been the ancestor to Homo florensis. And then there's another group of individuals called the Denisovans that also appear to be descendants of Homo erectus that are only known from a small number of bones found in a cave in Siberia. But from those bones, we've been able to extract DNA. So we've got the genome of the Denisovans, and we know that they are distinctly different from Homo sapiens and also from Neanderthals. So it's a third species of genus Homo that was extant at the time that Homo sapiens was migrating out of Africa and into Europe and Asia. And we see evidence of interbreeding, which we will get into, as I said, a little bit later in this presentation. So these are some of the species in this timeline that are of interest to us because of what they represent in terms of the evolution of hominins and specifically in the evolution ultimately of Homo sapiens. So the Australopithecines come in two specific forms, what are referred to as robust Australopithecines and gracile Australopithecines. And the reason why they come in two different forms is because of the nature of the diets that they seem to have adopted. And this is somewhat important in terms of the origin of genus Homo and very specifically Homo sapiens, but the other members of genus Homo as well. So the robust Australopithecines have a very solid jaw structure and very large muscles driving the lower jaw. And this is because they appear to have specialized in a diet that was very heavy on roots and berries and plant material in general. And so they needed these very powerful jaws to process this raw plant material. And as such, we don't think that they used meat as a source of nutrition. We don't think that they were scavengers of carcasses. We're pretty confident that they didn't have any form of tool use, that they were just gatherers of whatever was in the environment. And we don't think that they made any significant contribution to the evolution of genus Homo. Because when we look at genus Homo, the jaw structure is more consistent with the jaw structure of the gracile Australopithecines. These were more lightly built, were better able to stride across the landscape. All of the Australopithecines were bipedal. And as a consequence, likely it is amongst the gracile Australopithecines, the more lightly built Australopithecines, that we find the ancestors of genus Homo and obviously of ourselves. So when we go back and take a look at this lineage, we take a look at the we look at Adi, we look at Lucy, we look at Gari and Boisei, and these are the more gracile of the Australopithecines. When we look at Africanus, when we look at Robustus, we're looking at the more robust Australopithecines. The ones that lie further down here, we know very little about because we've only got partial skeletons, so we don't know whether these represent gracile or robust Australopithecines. But where we do have substantial fossil evidence, we do have these two basic lineages of Australopithecines, and it's amongst the gracile, so Ardipithecus, Afarensis, Boisei. These are the Australopithecines that we think lie in the lineage that gives rise to genus Homo. So I mentioned that bipedalism appears very early. And so I'm just going to put a note in here just as a reminder. Let me just double check to make sure I get the timeline right here. Yeah. So remember, this was the deal with Ardipithecus, that she has an ape-like foot, but was clearly bipedal on the basis of the hip joint and the knees and ankles. It's very clear that she had the capability to be bipedal and probably was bipedal. Lucy has a human-like foot. Now let me get the date for Lucy again. So she's around 4 million years. So when the note here says that about 1.9 million years ago, hominins start traveling long distances, this is more in keeping with the appearance of Homo erectus and Homo habilis. These are the members of genus Homo that show evidence of being able to travel long distances, and certainly in the case of Homo erectus, being able to migrate out of Africa, being the first hominin, being the first member of genus Homo to actually migrate out of Africa. Clearly, there is the capacity to travel over significant distance. And here you have the Laetoli footprints, and you can see the tracks here in the solidified volcanic ash. This is the artist's representation of what this group possibly represented. And Afarensis, remember, this is Lucy. And these date to around 3.5 million years ago. So again, the whole thing to remember here is bipedalism is a very, very early trait, not a late trait. It does not involve or require any of the other traits like a large brain, ability to think, that sort of thing is not required in order for the evolution of bipedalism. And in fact, even the skeletal modifications of the foot are not required for bipedalism. It's all about modifying the pelvis, modifying the hips. Ardi's pelvis is actually more ape-like in form, but her hip joint is more human-like, which is the reason why she can, or she could, walk on her hind legs, be bipedal. In the case of Lucy, Lucy's pelvis is more in line with humans. It's more oriented with the as a cradle sitting underneath the body, rather than as a supporting structure for connecting the hind legs for a tetrapod type of locomotion. So you do actually see some progressive modification of the pelvis and also of the hip joints to allow for a greater range of bipedal motion. And so in Lucy's case, we actually see a pelvis that is more in line with our own, a hip joint that is more in line with our own, and the location of the knees as a consequence is more in line with our own, more directly underneath the body in an upright condition. I mentioned that Homo habilis is the first hominin that shows clear evidence of tool construction in the form of flint knapping. So tools were made by flint knapping. So with this, you hit the flint with a large striker stone, break off shards, and have sharp edges. Later developments. So as the technology develops, the skill to shape stones for special purposes like axes, spear and arrow points, so many of these so-called Stone Age tools have their origins amongst this sort of technology that appears fairly early on in the history of hominins. And the most direct evidence we have is the evidence of butchering of bones. Now, this possibly means that, or it should not imply that at this point, these early hominins are acting as hunters. It's more likely that they're scavenging carcasses that other predators have brought down, and they're butchering the remains that have been left behind. It would be a little bit later on with the development of more specialized hunting tools that later hominins, and particularly Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, Erectus, would actually develop into hunters and bring down their own prey. But that would be later development as the technology for shaping stones into specialized tools developed over time. But the earliest tools were probably just shards of stone broken off the larger flint which would create sharp edges on the shards, and they could be then used as a butchering knife to cut meat off the bones of the carcasses that they came across as they scavenged the kills of other predators. So Homo habilis is the earliest member of genus Homo that we recognize in the fossil record. There is another species that probably existed at around the same time called Homo ergaster. There has been some question as to whether these two represent separate species or are actually members of the same species. Right now, ergaster is considered to be a separate species from habilis. And so you see reference to Homo ergaster again in the timeline table as coexisting at around the same time as habilis. This is part of the problem with trying to establish the evolution of genus Homo, and specifically the evolution of Homo sapiens, because many of these species are present at the same time and are living in similar regions. They're living next door to each other. They may even have overlapping ranges. This is all part of the problem of trying to establish who is in the direct line to Homo sapiens and who is tangential to it. So I've just mentioned ergaster. Then we have Homo erectus appearing as the first truly long distance traveler as far as genus Homo is concerned, and the first member of genus Homo, as I've mentioned previously, to migrate from Africa and become the ancestor of those members of genus Homo that Homo sapiens encountered when they, much later, around 100,000 years ago, made their first forays out of Africa into Asia and Europe. They encountered members of genus Homo, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and perhaps a third species that there is some evidence existed possibly in Europe, in Eastern Europe and on into Western Asia. And then, of course, at some point, either they encountered Homo florensis in Indonesia, or individuals of Homo sapiens gave rise to florensis as they migrated down through the Indonesian archipelago. We don't know the full story there. Neanderthals are members of genus Homo that are descended from erectus. They have enough genetic compatibility with Homo sapiens that interbreeding occurred. We know that because if you have your genome sequenced and you trace your ethnic origin to outside of Africa, not within sub-Saharan Africa, you will have somewhere between 2 to 3% of your genome made up of genes from Neanderthals, because we have now the complete genome of Neanderthals by extracting DNA out of Neanderthal bones and piecing together the fragments to create the full genome. And we can compare that with your own genome and identify genes that you possess that are of Neanderthal origin. In my case, I'm a little bit on the lower side. Yes, I've had my genome sequenced twice. And so my Neanderthal content is around 2.1 to 2.2%. So I'm on the low side of Neanderthal gene content. What is significant about this is that some of the genes that we know are of Neanderthal origin are unfortunately associated with some human disease conditions, including a predisposition to heart disease and some other conditions that are diseases of lifestyle and old age. Whether the Neanderthals actually suffered from these, we don't know, but we do know that when those genes are present in, or the alleles of those, certain alleles of those genes are present in the Homo sapien genome, this is the conditions that they lead to. Our impression of what Neanderthals were like as primitive cave dwellers, that is totally wrong. These were well adapted to the environment that they lived in, these hominins. They were adapted to a cool to cold climate. So we find them dominating Europe during the last ice age and shortly thereafter. And they appear to show evidence of a culture. They certainly buried their dead. They may have some spiritual culture because they included items that appear to have had some importance to the individual that was buried, or had importance to the individuals who were burying the dead. We know that they practiced care of the elders and injured, because we find evidence of injury in skeletons that have healed, which indicates that these individuals were supported in healing their injuries. So our view of Neanderthals is changing as a consequence of this, and certainly by looking at their genome and realizing that we share a lot of the same genes, including genes that, as I mentioned earlier, are associated with language and with culture. It appears that Neanderthals were much more like ourselves in many ways than we might have previously given them credit for. However, we do know that physiologically, their skulls were very different from ours. They were shorter, more solidly built. They had very prominent brow ridges. So these are the ridges that sit above the eyes. They had a larger, wider nose, but these are all adaptations to a very cold environment. And so, for instance, a shorter, stocky build means that they can retain body heat a lot more easily. The larger nose gives them the opportunity to warm the air before it hits the lungs. If you've ever been outside on a very cold day and taken a deep breath of air, you know exactly why you shouldn't, and why it would be an advantage to be able to preheat the air before it hits the lungs. And so these are all, we know that these are all adaptations to the cold environment. So Neanderthals, very highly adapted, probably very, a lot more similarity between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens in terms of behavior and culture than we might have previously thought, not the primitive cave dwelling individuals that they have been commonly portrayed as in the past. And then we know that there is another species of humans that live at the same time as the Neanderthals, east from the Neanderthal region in Siberia, known only from a small number of bones, a finger bone, a little bit of a skull, and I believe there's now a partial leg bone from a cave in Siberia known as the Denisova cave, and hence these are known as the Denisovans. The importance of this species of hominin, of humans, because a lot of people are now starting to use the term human for any species that is part of genus Homo. And now I've lost my train of thought. Let me just back up. So one of the reasons why we're interested in the Denisovans is because they are contemporaries of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and we know that Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals interbred. It's a question to ask whether there was interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Denisovans and Neanderthals and Denisovans. And the answer appears to be yes. When we look at the genomes of Melanesians, so these are the peoples who inhabit the western side of the Pacific Basin, not the eastern side. The eastern side are the Polynesians, so the western side are the Melanesians. and also the genomes of Australian Aborigines, we see evidence of Denisovan DNA. So it would appear that the ancestors of the Melanesians and the Australian Aborigines, as they migrated eastwards from Africa through Europe, interbred with the Denisovans, the evidence being the presence of Denisovan genetic sequences. And so we can answer the question, was there interbreeding between Homo sapiens and the Denisovans, with a definitive yes. Was there interbreeding between the Neanderthals and the Denisovans? That is a little bit more difficult to answer definitively, but the general feeling, based on the limited amount of genetic comparison that we can do, is that it likely occurred. It may not have been, may not have resulted in the transmission of Denisovan sequences via the Neanderthals to Homo sapiens, but certainly there appears to have been some interbreeding between the Neanderthals and the Denisovans on a local basis, but not perhaps on a wider geographical basis. So this is the phylogenetic tree that has been put in place to explain the migratory patterns and the interbreeding patterns between modern humans once they exit Africa and migrate to other locations, and what sort of interactions may have occurred between these migrating populations of Homo sapiens and the other humans, the other members of genus Homo that they encountered as they migrated. And so you can see where you've got these horizontal gene transfers between the Denisovans and the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and the Denisovans and Homo sapiens. So there's been a lot of interchange as the populations encountered each other as they migrated through, particularly as Homo sapiens migrated through the various locations inhabited by these other members, extant members of genus Homo at that time. So in terms of Homo sapiens, we appear in Africa around 200,000 years ago. All of modern Homo sapiens are ancestors of these individuals that appear in what is now referred to as sub-Saharan Africa. And the basis for making that conclusion is on the basis of genetic variation. When you look particularly at mitochondrial DNA, and remember mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child directly, predominantly at least, we see the greatest variation in mitochondrial DNA sequences in sub-Saharan Africa. Once we get outside of sub-Saharan Africa, the degree of mitochondrial variation is very, very limited, indicating that Homo sapiens outside of Africa draw their mitochondrial DNA sequences from a very small population of individuals, not from the overall population of individuals that contribute to mitochondrial DNA variety in sub-Saharan Africa. This is clear indication of a migration of a subset of Homo sapiens out of Africa at some point in the past. When? Maybe as recently as 60,000 years ago, maybe as early as 100,000 years ago, but somewhere in that time frame. How many individuals made up the migrating population? Probably as few as 6,000, maybe as many as 10,000, but somewhere in that range is the number of individuals that we believe represent the migration population that migrated out of Africa. Did they all leave at once? No. We know that the migration took place over time. So it was multiple small groups that migrated out that contributed to the migration of Homo sapiens across the planet. And not all of those small migrating groups migrated in the same direction. So some migrated up into Europe, some migrated up into Central Asia, others migrated more towards East Asia. Some migrated around the coast of Asia, through India and down through the Indonesian archipelago and eventually across the Timor Strait into Australia some 40,000 years ago, although there is evidence that perhaps Homo sapiens may have arrived in Australia as early as 60,000 years ago. At some point around 20,000 years ago, populations of Homo sapiens migrated out of eastern Siberia across what is now the strait separating Siberia from Alaska, but at the time had a land bridge because this was during one of the ice ages that lowered the ocean level and exposed land so that they could migrate in. We do think that North America had a substantial Homo sapiens population at least by around 13,000 years ago, because there is 13,000, the transcript said 30,000. It should say 13,000. So about 13,000 years ago, we see evidence of a group of individuals that we call the Clovis people, based on flint technology that was first identified in a dig site at Clovis, New Mexico. Very characteristic way of shaping arrow points that is utilized even to this day by Native Americans who still practice the art of flint knapping. These are very, very characteristic arrow points. This has created a certain level of conflict because the same technology appears to have developed in Europe, Western Europe, in what is now modern day France. And there is an ongoing discussion as to exactly when the first Homo sapiens made it to North America. What is really creating a lot of disruption here is the fact that there are some sites in South America and Central America that date to much earlier than this 13,000 year time frame for the Clovis people, who are thought to represent the direct ancestors of all Native Americans. And let's just say there's no easy answer here. The dates for these human habitations in South America, and it's down near the tip of South America, not in the central region of South America, but down near the tip of South America, which means they've migrated all the way down through South America to establish these habitations. The dates on these have been checked and double checked, and they really do date to timeframes that predate the 13,000 year time frame for the Clovis people. So there is an ongoing, let's say, conversation about when Homo sapiens truly made it first to North America. It is problematic. So members of species that may be related to Homo sapiens as a product of the migration could be this small hominin, Homo floresiensis, that was discovered on the island of Florence in the Indonesian archipelago. There was a lot of controversy about whether this represented a true dwarf species of humans or whether it was a genetic abnormality, because there are genetic abnormalities that cause some of the anatomical features that were seen in or are seen in Homo floresiensis. And so when the species was first discovered, or when the fossils were first discovered, some individuals were willing to identify this as a new species. Other people said, no, 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 this is just a genetic abnormality. The general thinking right now is that it truly does represent a dwarf species. Hence the tag, the Hobbit, because these are quite short. They're only about 3 or 4 feet in stature. They're quite short, but it appears to be a stable population. Then very recently in South Africa, you have this new species of hominin, Homo naledi, which is very human-like, but has a smaller brain. And its time frame in the timeline substantially predates Homo sapiens. So we're not entirely sure what the nature of Homo naledi is as far as the timeline of the evolution of genus Homo. But it is very much a distinct species. It's very clear that it is a distinct species. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on this species yet. And I believe that there is an ongoing attempt right now to extract DNA out of the fossil bone to try and generate the genome of Naledi to do comparisons between Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and hopefully some of the other members of genus Homo that we might be able to extract DNA out of. Of course, if we can get the DNA sequences and we can do genetic comparisons, we may be able to create a more definitive phylogenetic tree of genus Homo, but that remains to be seen because recovery of DNA from fossilized bone is a very difficult thing to do. It can be done, but you have to be very, very cautious because you have to make sure that the DNA that you're extracting truly is the DNA of the individual and not contamination. And this was one of the real concerns when the first attempts were made for extracting DNA out of Neanderthal bone. Technology was developed to allow the clean extraction of Neanderthal DNA. And so that technology is now being applied to bones from other members of genus Homo, where there is at least the potential to be able to extract DNA. So at some point in the not too distant future, I expect that we will be able to create a more definitive phylogenetic tree, at least of genus Homo. So the FOXP2 gene, I'm not going to talk very much about it. It's mentioned here. One of the problems with talking about FOXP2 is that while it is associated with language, and certainly in humans is associated with language, and a version of FOXP2 that is essentially identical to our own version is found in Neanderthals, exactly what its role is in language is unclear. There has been a lot of research done in the last 20 years or so, once FOXP2 was identified and was associated with language, to try and identify just exactly at the genetic level what is necessary for language. And neurologists and biologists are still puzzling as to what exactly is the genetic basis for the development of the ability to speak in the sense that we understand language. And what is the actual origin of the ability to speak in the form of language as we understand language? We don't really have time in this class to go into a detailed discussion of it. I have done a little bit of research for another class on this whole question of the origin of speech and the origin of intelligence and higher thought. And it's an interesting topic, but it's also a difficult topic to talk about because there's a lot of conflicting data and a lot of conflicting opinion. So let's just leave it there for now. We do know that Homo sapiens possibly are the first member of genus Homo to think symbolically and to create symbolic representations of the world around them. But again, that is also being subjected to question because there is some suggestion that Neanderthals possibly left markings behind in caves, similar to the cave paintings that we associate with early Homo sapiens that are found in caves in Spain and France and other locations around the world. But Spain and France are the ones that are most famous. And it's possible that other species of genus Homo may have also had the ability to create symbolic representations of the world around them. This is, again, subject to further investigation and discussion. But we do know that Homo sapiens, at least, does possess the ability to think logically, to think symbolically, and to create symbolic representations. And this is one of the very earliest symbolic representations, or what is being interpreted as a symbolic representation of the external world, in the form of these scratch marks on the side of the stone. These are, let me see if I've got the date in here. I didn't put the date in here, but I believe these date to around, I'm going to say around 30 to 40,000 years ago. I think that's the sort of time frame we're talking about for these markings. They're certainly some of the very earliest symbolic representations left behind by early Homo sapiens. So there is a lot of that we could talk about here. I've barely scratched the surface. What I'm going to do is direct you to go to a site that I have referenced in the resources page for this chapter. It's a website called Becoming Human, and it's moderated by a very famous paleoanthropologist named Donald Johanson. And he is based now at Arizona State University, which is where the website is based. And it is probably the single best website that I've ever come across for presenting the full story of human evolution, going all the way back to Ardi. And I've mentioned before the videos that I show when we do lab on campus. Donald Johanson features in the last program of the set of 3, and he talks with the presenter, Neil Shubin, who I've mentioned in previous presentations. And they talk about Ardi, and they meet with the individual who's had the greatest role to play in interpreting Ardi's skeleton. They also talk about Lucy, and Don Johanson talks at length about Lucy. They also go out and start looking for evidence of human tools with someone who has been researching Homo habilis, I believe, is the organism that he's looking at. And all of the sites that are visited as part of this section of that particular video are all within about 100 miles of each other. And this is why the Rift Valley in East Africa is such an important location, because all of this radiation of genus Homo and this large number of individuals that are clearly members of genus Homo appears to only have been possible because of the Rift Valley environment. And so you find all of these species emerging out of this very, very small region in Eastern Africa. And again, this website, yeah, I'll put it this way. If you take a look at the literature that covers the evolution of genus Homo, and particularly Homo sapiens, you find that there is a lot of ego involved amongst the individuals who write the papers, being very defensive of their own position and being very negative about the position of others. Because there's a lot at stake here because of the importance of understanding the origin of Homo sapiens. It stands to reason that discussing our own origins and figuring out our own origins would be quite important. And so there's a lot of ego involved in these discussions. One of the things that is very clear about Don Johanson is that he is not willing to let his personal feelings get in the way of presenting what is known. Does he have a personal position on the origin of Homo sapiens and the evolution of genus Homo? Absolutely. And he does present that, but he also presents the alternatives. And he places just as much weight on the alternatives as he does on his own interpretation. And that's what the power of this website, Becoming Human, is. It shows you, or it presents all of the hypotheses that have been floated that are considered to be credible. And so it's a really good website to go and visit if you haven't already taken a look at it because you saw it listed in the resources sections. So if you get a chance, go and take a look at it. It's a really interesting website. Anyway, let's take a look at this last concept check question, and then we can close down this presentation and bring the presentations for the semester to a close. So here's our final concept check question. Describe some characteristics that differentiate hominins from other apes. So of course, the big one is bipedal locomotion. Another one would be a short jaw. And by the way, the short jaw is still continuing. If you have ever had your wisdom teeth extracted, the reason why is because our jaw appears to be getting shorter, and there is no longer room for the wisdom teeth, which are the last set of molars at the back of the upper and lower jaws. So this evolutionary trend towards a shorter jaw, a shorter jaw is still ongoing in Homo sapiens. And that is evidenced by the increasing trend to remove the wisdom teeth. And also when people need their teeth straightened and realigned, a lot of that is because there is insufficient room for all the teeth that we are trying to squeeze into the jaw. We only have 32 teeth in total, 16 in each jaw, but that is substantially less than even our ape cousins. They have more than we have because they have a longer jaw. So decreasing the size of the jaw, bipedalism, symbolic thought. I mean, you can go back and take a look at the derived traits of the hominins at the beginning of this section. Any of those, or a combination of those, depending on how many you're asked to talk about, if you're asked to talk about them in an exam question, for instance, would work. Just make sure that you feel familiarized with that list of derived traits for hominins. So that brings us to the end of this presentation and to the end of the chapters for this class. Hopefully you found it interesting and thought-provoking. And again, as I always do, if you have any questions or concerns or comments about anything that I've presented in this presentation, by all means, feel free to contact me via email. I welcome your questions. So bye for now.